This, creative writing workshop video was requested by Tree Squared on Patreon. Hopefully it is slightly more useful to you than I think it's going to be. The suggested topic was, perhaps a synopsis on how to make a well-thought-out character before going over a list of how to make a character interesting, which appears to demonstrate a bit of wrong-headedness. First of all, how to make a well-thought-out character is leading. For one, the answer is in the question. You think it out. But second, I must stress that a well-thought-out character is not inherently better than an organically developed one. And interesting is a woefully vague and subjective word, arousing curiosity and holding or catching attention. You could do that with a design, or an art style, or an implication that doesn't even necessarily have to be delivered on, or a plot twist, or hell, even boobs in the thumbnail. And a list of how to make a character interesting is sort of an oxymoron. Lists are boring. They're sort of the antithesis of creativity. That exact type of thinking is what led to all of the stereotypes that we know and loathe today. Not to say that a stereotypical character can't be interesting. Being interesting isn't an internal property. It has a factor of tokenism to it. If someone does something unique or original, that might be interesting. But if someone else does it, then it's a homage or a ripoff. And if 100 people do it, it's a trend. Or a meme. And if 1 million people do it over the next 100 years, well, now it's an archetype, or a stereotype. So trying to apply rules or formulas is counterintuitive. It might be a good idea to find a rule that other people are following and break it, or find a formula that someone else came up with and deviate from it. Which is a fine philosophy if originality is your goal, but being original doesn't catch nearly as much attention as being derivative these days. So that question may have been better directed at a marketing specialist than a critic. Hey, you want to make a character really interesting? Lesbians. Here, I'll prove it. Look, I'll take 2 identical characters. Commander Shepard and Commander Shepard. Which one's more interesting? Female Shepard, right. No contest. You know why? Liara. Bam. Lesbians. You want to make a male character more interesting? Same plan. Add a lesbian. Take this as an example. Straight, white, middle-aged, boring. Add a lesbian, suddenly he's the most interesting character in the world. You want to make a character interesting completely independently of being attached to any story at all? Make her gay. Is your character literally the dumbest thing to ever walk the earth? Give her a girlfriend. Now she's interesting. But on the subject of thinking out a character, there's a Carl Sagan quote that I think applies. If you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe. Thinking something out presupposes that relevant data already exists. So it's only really valuable when the arc is the focus of the story. Like if you have a very specific sequence of events that you want to portray, or if there's some thematic point that you're trying to make at the expense of everything else, and the characters are largely incidental to that end. If the origin of a creative idea is, say, like in Act 3 of a story, there are significantly more considerations to be made when populating the story with characters. So maybe I'm just the wrong person to ask altogether, because to me, thinking out a character sounds backwards. Everything I've ever written has started out by imagining an action, and trying to figure out what kind of person would do a thing like that. Because in the most utilitarian sense of the word, a character is a vessel for a verb. Thinking about characters you're writing as who is unhelpful. A character you're writing is a tool. You should think of them as what they are doing and why they are doing it. And it's up to the audience to decide whether the answers to those questions would fall in line with what a real human being would do well enough for them to be considered actual people. Whether you start with a sequence of actions and reverse engineer a collection of traits to justify those actions, or start with a collection of traits and organically build a series of actions from them, makes no difference. But the plot and characters... and setting? Jeez, did I talk about the setting at all in this video? No, I didn't. Crap. But the plot, setting, and characters should all really influence each other, to the point where you shouldn't even know what you want to write until you finish the first draft. Thinking out a character or anything means you need as much information as possible before you start considering the connections. And things will change in your own mind while moving through the chronology of the story. So going through all the classic pre-writing steps after your first draft is already done in some form is helpful for 2 reasons. 1, while writing, you don't feel constrained by any ideas that you thought were good before you started writing. And 2, you have much more and much better information to work with when you're plotting out your characters and story seriously. And some things that might even outwardly sound like horrible ideas can be portrayed very well. For instance, giving a character a flaw that exactly relates to the problem they have to overcome. That sounds like a grade A #1 way to make your story feel artificial, boring, and predictable. Like, oh dear, however will this guy with a speech impediment ever deliver an extremely important public speech? Oh, woe is me, I'm such a failure as a writer, I'm going to cry into my Oscar for Best Picture and Best Screenplay, boo-hoo. Do you see what I mean? In real life, you'll never really run into situations where each and every one of your skills are useful and each and every one of your weaknesses are tested. So your characters shouldn't be like that either. They should have traits that imply a life beyond what's happening in the plot, and those traits should probably affect the way they behave in some way. However, if there's one thing that I highly prefer you keep in mind when writing a character, it's the relationship between depth and complexity. Making a character more complex for the sake of it is a great way for me to lose interest in your story. Making them deeper is a great way to engage me. For an example of what I mean that ties this back into the original question a little better, another one of my patrons asked me to review a Ruby OC, and a line in her personality description really piqued my interest. She is quite naive to her distaste. Now don't get me wrong, I don't want you to use this trait, just observe how the traits of naivety, fine, and disliking naivety, also fine, play off each other in a way that implies a whole host of other traits, like self-awareness and a little self-loathing, and some desperation to overcome her perceived flaws, which could manifest as gullibility. When characters' traits interact to imply more traits, that's depth. But saying write like that is unhelpful because, again, it comes down to your own creativity, even in the context of writing an OC, because being an extension of an existing work doesn't take the pressure off of your own creativity. There's your video, Tree Squared. If you found any part of this helpful, I will be surprised. And if anyone else watching wants their own, potentially marginally helpful video, you can support me on Patreon. I used Joy Alma's OC as an example in this video. There is a link in the description.